So as we talk now about selection, we largely address the concept of selection and placement in the big picture when we're talking about the notion of selection. They're actually two separate processes. Selection is gathering the data, placement is then matching them to the job and making a job offer to them in that context. But for all intents and purposes, when we're talking about selection in the big picture, that's actually what we're getting at is both the process of collecting the information that's legally defensible and then ultimately offering them the job to a position that where they're best matched. So those two things work really importantly hand in hand together. How do we evaluate whether or not a selection tool is worth using? Because not all selection tools are equally valuable to the organization. We need to consider both reliability and validity. Reliability is how consistent a item is measuring what it's intended to measure, and validity is making sure that it actually is measuring what we expect it to measure. So reliability is just about the consistency. Validity is about the accuracy of that measurement.
Selection tools are assessed based on the reliability and validity of those selection tools. It's important that we have good measures, good tools that not only give us consistent information, but give us consistent information that we can depend on to give us accurate information about the candidate's ability to perform the job. So defining reliability, and we can see that reliability means that something is very consistent or dependable. And what we're basically looking for is the measures that we're using to assess our job candidates. They have to be consistent over time, over different forms, and also we need to have consistency within the number of questions that we ask of a particular measure. And we are measuring all sorts of different attributes. We're measuring people's knowledge, we're measuring people's skills, we're measuring people's abilities, we're measuring their interests, all sorts of things. And you can see there on the list, certain things have very high reliability, meaning they're, people's physical characteristics, such as their height, their weight, those sorts of things, fairly consistent, fairly reliable. You'll weigh within reason, pretty much, over a certain short period of time, you'll weigh the same, you'll be the same height. Same things with our abilities and skills. I would give you a typing test today and a typing test tomorrow, or a cognitive ability test today and or a cognitive ability test tomorrow. Those, your scores will stay fairly consistent between each time that you take it. Things like interests, however, can vary over time. And as you get older, as we mature, as we are exposed to new things, our interests will change. And so doing an interest inventory is good in a very short-term basis, but from a long-term perspective, the things that I was interested in as a high school student are certainly not the things I'm interested in now as a college professor at the age of 47. Things that are very low in reliability are things like how sociable you feel, or the emotional stability, or even things like cooperativeness, because these things can vary from moment to moment and day to day. You wake up in a bad mood, or you don't have enough sleep, and certainly your ability to be sociable and cooperative goes down the toilet very easily. Validity is about making sure that the measure that you're using accurately is predicting job performance. So we want to know if the person is able to perform the job, and if we're doing an accurate measure and an accurate predictor of someone's ability to perform. Reliability is absolutely necessary because I could ask you every day, what's 2 plus 3, and you could tell me 6, and then I say, well, what's 2 plus 3 the next day, and you'll tell me it's 6, and then the next day you say it's 6. But the bottom line is 2 plus 3 is 5. You're consistent, but you're not accurate. So our measure can very consistently give me the same result over and over and over again, but it doesn't mean that it's accurate. So what we're looking for is a measure has to be reliable, first of all. So I need to know that every single time I go to that measure, it's going to tell me the same results every single time. And then I need to make sure that it's valid. that it actually measures what it says it's going to measure. And that's, of course, the next goal. So validity is making sure that the measure is actually assessing what it says it's going to assess. And each test that we use, whether it's an interview questions, or whether it's a cognitive ability test or a physical ability test, all of these things are absolutely required of us. We must make sure that we are using valid measures. If we're not using valid measures, we're in violation of the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures, the UGESP, as you see there, and it does require us to use validated tools. There are a number of different ways that we can validate them. How we do that is not really the purpose of this class. What you do need to know as managers and as future HR professionals is that our measures need to be reliable and valid, and we know that when we are going to a vendor or if we're developing interview questions, that we can turn to our vendor and we can ask them the question, is this a reliable tool? Give me the reliability measure. Is this an accurate tool? What is the validity of it? Is it good and is it predictable amongst the type of people that I want to hire for this, using this tool? If someone tells you that they have a reliability that's 10% and a validity measure that's also, 0.1, you've got a problem. You've got a measure that's not very good. But if someone tells you I've got a reliability of 90% and I have a validity coefficient of 0.5, that's excellent. And those are the kinds of things that we're looking for. We want to know that we can predict. The tools that we're using as a manager are going to be able to predict performance. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure we ask HR, or that we are thinking about the kinds of selection tools that we want to use, or the interview questions that we want to ask, or even if we're the ones having to go to the vendor and say, I need a test that measures X, whatever X is, we need to make sure that it is reliable, it is valid, it is going to predict what we want it to predict. On to the next slide. The selection sequence is fairly straightforward. The applicant enters the process and they go to the organization, and the organization goes through what we call initial assessment methods. And those initial assessment methods are things like application blanks and reviews of resumes and maybe even reviews of, letters of recommendations or things like that. Biodata is another good example of that. And you could see that on the next slide. We'll go through that really quickly in a moment. But the initial selection tools, once someone passes the initial selection assessment, they move into candidacy, which means they've passed muster, they have the minimum requirements, and then we move on to the candidacy, where we go into much more substantive, in-depth assessments. And those kinds of things are usually ability tests or personality tests, things of that nature. I beg your pardon of that alarm. That was my corn muffins telling me that they were ready. Okay, so we were talking about substantive selection tests, and once someone passes those substantive selection tests, they go through personality tests or ability tests to really get at whether or not they are capable of doing a particular job. Those candidates become finalists. And then sometimes we just make a choice among those finalists, perhaps based on who we believe will fit best into our company, or we may go on to additional tools which are called discretionary tools. And those discretionary tools are really trying to differentiate who is going to be the final person. Again, we may be assessing person organization, something that we need to make sure we assess. And then lastly, we may make offers to individuals, but again, those offers may be contingent upon a number of different things. And some of those things that they may be contingent on is passing a drug test or passing a physical, or making sure that they graduate when they're supposed to graduate. And then ultimately, if they pass those contingent hirings, if they pass their background check, they become the new hire. And that's the way basically that flow happens. The applicant goes from the applicant to the candidate once they pass the initial screening. They become a finalist if they get through the next hurdle, and then ultimately could receive an offer and then ultimately get the job. The different types of selection methods, if you'll go to the next couple of slides, These are fairly straightforward. Your initial selection things would include things like resumes and cover letters, application blanks, bio data where you're filling out, biographical information about what you do or some of the accomplishments that you've had. We can get references, and that could be a background check, it could be letters of recommendations, it could be reference checks, things of that nature. Handwriting analysis may also be something that you might see. Now that's typically bogus. It doesn't usually have any relationship with job performance, but a lot of employers will put people through handwriting analysis to kind of get a better sense of what their personalities are like. Literacy testing is also important, particularly if you're at the entry level, and we want to make sure people have some basic literacy. We may be hiring, for example, cleaning staff for a hotel.
Particularly immigrants who are hired and they may not have English as their primary language.
And so, again, we would want to see whether or not these individuals have basic literacy. Do they know how to read and write and things like that? Genetic screening may also be an issue, and again, we have to be very, very careful about how we use genetic screening. We need to know where people may be vulnerable to anything that they may be exposed to in the workplace, but that doesn't mean that we can screen someone out because of that. We can simply have information and inform somebody whether or not their genetic screening has indicated that there's a problem. Also, there may be some initial interviews that we may use typically in that initial screening process where we're trying to sort out who is got the minimum qualifications and who does not. The next couple slides deal with the substantive selection tools, and typical things you might see are personality tests, or as we said, ability tests, integrity tests, interest inventories, and interviews. We have to be very, very careful with the interviews that we use, that we don't rely on those stream of consciousness, unreliable, unstructured interviews, and we'll talk about that in a moment. In terms of the personality tests, most personality tests are trying to assess the big five: conscientiousness, emotional stability, extroversion, openness to experience, and agreeableness. And what you'll see in parentheses next to each one of those things is whether or not they have any promise for predicting job performance. And the most broadly promising one is conscientiousness, and that's getting at a general competency, and much of the research now in HR and in the practitioner area is focusing on assessing competencies, general job competencies, and utilizing those to make hiring decisions. Also ones that have a promise. Emotional stability. Again, what we're looking for is whether or not someone can handle ups and downs and stressors and as things become more taxing to them. And we usually assess this for things like sales managers or teachers or general management positions. Extroversion also has some promise, at least if not for nothing else, for people where having more of an extroverted personality makes sense, like in sales positions and things like that, where we actually would think that there is some agreement in openness to experience and agreeableness. We really don't see much prediction for job performance. However, openness to new experience may indicate that someone has entrepreneurial aspirations or capabilities. If they're open to new ideas and new ventures, then being open to new experiences may certainly lend them to being a greater likelihood of being a good entrepreneur. Moving on to the next slide, we have ability tests, and ability tests can measure basically four general areas: cognitive ability, psychomotor ability, physical, and sensory perceptual. And I'm going to show you some video clips and give you some indication on what might be some good psychomotor tests. 15 to 20% of organizations use ability tests in their selection procedures, and typically they either get at aptitude, which is what someone's innate capabilities are, or achievements, what you have learned, through skill and education and things like that. Other substantive tests would be things like integrity tests, and the integrity tests can be very overt, where they're pretty much asking you, would you lie, would you steal, or they can be veiled purpose, and those are the ones that are much more common where you're taking a test and you don't know what that test is assessing, but it's getting at certain characteristics that one would say are consistent with someone who has higher integrity or greater honesty in the workplace and are less likely to steal. Interest inventories do help to some extent, mostly for person organization fit, not really for person job fit. So be very, very careful in using those. And they do try to assess, whether or not someone will, what their decision-making styles will be and how they can be best utilized in the workplace. So while these work better as developmental tools, they can also really help us to figure out whether someone will fit in within a work group or they will do well within an overall organization. Lastly, interviews. Interviews tend to be, the way that we have them in organizations, they tend to be very unstructured. They're more stream of consciousness. We ask all sorts of questions and we're not really clear whether these questions are related. We may be getting at things like, oh, where'd you go to school? Oh, I know that person, etc., etc., and you go off on tangents. What's very important when we're doing interviews, even though interviews are not the most reliable tool we could use, people still don't want to set them aside and not use them. So we can use an interview as part of a whole battery of tests where we could have things like the interview, which are lower in terms of their reliability and validity, and combine that with tools like cognitive ability tests, which tend to be higher in their reliability and validity. With respect to the most reliable and valid tools, cognitive ability tests and general ability tests always rank the highest. Personality tests follow. Work samples are also very high. And lastly are things like interviews. They are not very reliable. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't use them. We can use them, but we use them in a very structured way that gets more information for us to be able to make better decisions. So one way that we can battle some of the problems with interviews is, as I said, to have structured interview questions where we ask everyone the same question, which requires us to prepare these things in advance. These structured questions also have to be related to the characteristics of the job and the requirements of the job that we set in our job descriptions, which means that we need to be sure that the questions that we're asking are linked to the important characteristics, knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to do a particular job. The next thing that we need to do to improve interviews is to have behavioral questions where we are asking very specific behaviors. In the past, what did you do? And if they can give me an indication of what they've done in the past, that's a good predictor, not a perfect predictor, but a good predictor of how people will perform in the future. Other things that we can do is create situational questions and situational interviews questions, which is getting at hypotheticals. If you were in this situation, how would you get yourself out of this problem? How would you solve this, and what would be the procedure, the step-by-step procedure you would use to solve this problem? Now, this is not quite as good as behavioral questions, but they are fairly high in terms of improving interview structure and interview validity. Lastly, we need to be very careful in our interviews of asking appropriate or inappropriate questions. Anything that is protected as a form of discrimination under civil rights law, things like age. We can't ask about age. We need to make sure someone is at least minimally qualified in terms of age, and there are some jobs that require people to be 18 years or 21 years and older, working, for example, in a casino. You have to be 21 to work in a casino. You have to be 18 to work with children.
You need to be 21, for example, to serve alcohol.
Next, we're going to discuss discretionary assessment methods. And again, as we talked about, these are the types of tools that we might use to differentiate among the finalists to figure out which ones we want to hire. I mean, typically these finalists are the tops of the company, and they're usually the most qualified. So now the challenge that we have is trying to differentiate between those top 2 or 3 or even 4 candidates if we're lucky enough to have that. Again, things that we may be assessing are person-organization match, someone's motivation level to do a particular job, or looking at citizenship behaviors and things like that, because certainly we want to hire someone who has the highest level of citizenship behavior, someone who's going to go above and beyond for the company as best as they can. Next slide, we're talking about contingent assessment methods. Typically, as we said, we offer a job contingent on passing certain hurdles. It may be that they need to have a security clearance, they need to pass a drug test, they need to pass a medical exam, any number of things. Complete a degree, have a valid license to be an accountant, or you name it. So there's all sorts of things that we can use as contingent selection tools. When we are dealing with the Americans with Disabilities Act, we make our offer contingent upon whether or not someone can pass a medical exam and that they can do the job and the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation.
In our last slide, how selection decisions are made, it's important to consider that there's not one right way to make a decision. For example, we have to determine where a cutoff score should be. And a cutoff score is the minimally acceptable score that someone needs to get on an assessment in order to be eligible for hire for a job. And we can set up the cutoff score depending on whether or not we want to be very strict and narrow in the approach that we want to take to who passes and who fails, or whether or not we want to be more generous. And again, it really depends on how essential the skill is and how narrow or broad the range of skill set is in order to be considered at least minimally acceptable. And I mean, so what the kind of cutoff score that we might set for an engineer who needs to have a particular skill set may be very different than the skill set we would want to set for somebody going to work for McDonald's. For example, if you want to go work as a fry cook at McDonald's, you pretty much need to know how to, write your name, read numbers and letters, and be able to walk and pick up food. So your literacy ability, for example, that you might be assessing would be pretty broad, as long as people can read basic words and know how to give back change. Your threshold would be fairly low on that. Versus a high-level skill, particularly a rare skill that you want people to have, you would want to set the standard pretty high. So that cutoff score is going to vary depending on how broad the skill base is that you want to be able to assess. In terms of how decisions are made, there's a number of different ways we can go about this. Number one would be a single predictor, and we tend to shy away from single predictors because single predictors are basically looking at one particular aspect of a job and only evaluating on that ability. And of course, not every job is one-dimensional. If we have a one-dimensional job like a ditch digger, then pretty much we want to assess on how well they can dig ditches, which is a very, very different thing than a more complex job like a CEO's job, which might have multiple predictors. And so moving on from there, you've got two different approaches. A multiple hurdle approach, where every hurdle that you want to set up, that person has to pass those hurdles in order to be able to be successful on the job. And we typically use a multiple hurdle approach where the room for error is pretty high. Right, so an airline pilot or something along that nature, where or a surgeon, right, a mistake in an area, high skills in one area doesn't overcompensate for skills that are low in another area. They have to be high in all the skills and all the abilities and issues that we have to assess for. So a multiple hurdle approach is more relevant when we're dealing with high-skilled, high-stakes jobs. A compensatory approach is where we're looking at the holistic view of the applicant, and we are allowing for strengths in one area to compensate for weaknesses in other areas. And so we expect, particularly in those areas that are weaker, those are things that we can train them to do on the job. So there might be a job where someone has some problems with some basic computer skills, but they have really great customer service skills. So we might get them on the job, train them on those computer skills, and then that balances it all out. So there isn't one right way to make a decision. We do need to consider, though, the importance of that position and what skills are essential that they need to have coming in the door that we don't want to train them on, and what skills are okay if they're lower because we can always train them the way we want to train them when they come to the job. So that is the last slide, and that's our information on selection systems.